in this presentation, I'm going to talk about a part of the main findings from the interviews in my British Academy and Leverhulme funded research project. So I will first introduce the project information first, and then I'm going to discuss the situation in the UK and the three threats against media freedom in the UK found by the research. So this research project explores the political discourses and the practices of media freedom in the UK since 2016. And it is funded by the British Academy and Leverhulme. So this symposium actually it's a kind of outcome research dissemination event of this project. And in terms of the research in this project, it takes a mixed method approach by using a combination of different research methods. For example, traditional social science research method like interviews and critical discourse analysis, as well as computational analysis like topical modeling. But in this presentation, I will only report a part of the main findings from the interviews. So for this part of the research, so far I have conducted more than 40 semi-structured, in-depth interviews with UK journalists, editors, media lawyers, trade union, regulators, NGOs, and campaigners. So now let's have a look at the situation in the UK. Well, I don't want to spend too much time to talk about the concept of media freedom because it is a highly contested concept. But I wanted to introduce what is the concept this research is based on. So this research see media freedom as the ability of journalists to freely access information and freely report on topics of public interest. So it sees media freedom as an essential value of democracy. And mainly, actually, it is more focused on the external influence on news media, on journalistic practice, rather than focus on the internal influence, such as the autonomy in terms of choosing topics internally within the newsroom. It is more about examining the relationship between journalism and external society, external social entities such as politics and other social entities, and how what kind of freedom journalists could have in terms of access information, in terms of reports on topics of public interest. Sorry, let me get the person getting okay. So yeah, that's the media freedom concept, and it is important because a free media can inform the public, can fulfill their right to know, and hold power accountable. And if we talk about media system in the UK, if we use the model, the typology developed by Helling and Mancini in 2004. So we can find the political and the media system in the UK actually fall into the category of North Atlantic or liberal model. So basically, the state plays quite a weak role, but the market quite strong in terms of the press. But in terms of press, because press is self-regulated and partisan commercial press. But in terms of public broadcasting media, it is a different story. And this is because UK has parliamentary democracy and UK has a relatively weak role of the UK. So usually we would see UK, has a free commercial press, and its broadcasting system overseen by the Ofcom. So we usually see UK as has a quite long tradition of free media, especially commercial press. and it has a long tradition of protecting media freedom, so does not kind of exert direct media control over news media. So therefore we cannot really compare the UK to authoritarian countries such as Russia and China. We can't compare, the threat against media freedom in the UK compared to media censorship in those countries. So if we look into the literature, we'll find that existing discussions regarding the situation in the UK is often surrounding the implications of media regulation and the legislation, laws for media freedom. So rather than other types of media control, for example, like restricted information access, etc. However, I believe, we have noticed that recently observers have expressed concerns about the emergence of restraining, controlling political environment that limits media freedom in the UK. For example, Reporters Without Borders 2023 index ranks the UK 26 out of 180 countries for press freedom. It was 2 places down from 2022. And we have seen more recent events, for example, politicians, they try to ban journalists from attending press conferences and the police arrests of journalists. All these recent events actually indicate there have been these new developments in media in terms of media freedom in the UK, and this also suggests actually the threat towards media freedom has gone beyond those from legal regime. So what the research so far has found from the interviews, there are the interviews point to 3 main threats. I'm not saying these are the only threats, but these, I would say, the 3 main threats against the media freedom in the UK. The first is the legal threat. Arini, how much time do I have?
You have another 7 minutes.
7 minutes, okay. So I try to go through this quickly. So the first is legal threats. The legal threats has been recognized as the largest threat to media freedom in the UK in the literature. So the current research also echoes this point. For example, in the interviews, the chilling effects of law on media freedom has been recognized by editors, media lawyers, trade union, regulators, NGOs, and campaigners. But interestingly, for journalists, not everybody recognize their work being affected by legal threat. So these worries, their worries mostly focus on the implications of laws, such as strategic lawsuits against public participation, which is SLAPS, and the 2017 GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. First in the UK and then in the first in the Europe and then in the UK, and more recently National Security Act. So Natasha is going to talk in detail about the SLAPS on the next panel. So I'm not going to go into details, but here just to briefly say SLAPS, has been seen as a kind of purpose to intimidate and silence individual journalists, especially those investigative journalists. I think we have seen quite prominent examples like the threat of Aaron Banks against Carol Cadwaladar. She is an investigative journalist who exposed the Facebook scandal in 2018. So Aaron Bank just accused over her 2 tweets and 2 public talks she made in 2019. And a similar kind of attack also can see in the case of Elliot Higgins, the founder of Bellingcat. So in terms of legal threat, for small independent newsrooms and their journalists are particularly vulnerable, although large legacy news organizations also quite suffer. For example, a senior editor said in the interview that although bigger media houses have their own legal team, but the threats posed by SLAPS and the Defamation Act 2013 have increased their investment in checking stories before publication as a kind of precaution and preparing, to avoid the lawsuits. So another editor explained, a case they just experienced, for example, in which, they received a threatening letter regarding an article they were dealing with, and the letter threat, it's quite threatening because it say, the information is confidential, so you can't publish it. If you are going to publish it, then we are going to take out an injunction against you. So the thing is, they bring in their lawyers and they talked us through, and they found that the cost of fighting in injunction is really, really expensive, no matter you win or lose. So therefore, this kind of threat would really have the effect on what they decided to publish, what they can't publish. And the second threat, which has been relatively under-examined actually in the literature, is the increasing restrictions on information access in terms of both, FOI requests, freedom of information requests, as well as the daily information access. So all these journalist participants actually, they reported a big frustration in receiving data through FOI requests. So FOI requests does give journalists the right to request access to government information. So especially, for those data that are not public records data, that are not published on data portal as open data. So these actually give journalists the right to request, the right to request access to this data. However, 18 years on, the situation has changed. Actually, the access to data via to public records data via FOI actually become quite grim for UK journalists. And for example, a journalist when the journalist talked to me in April this year, and the journalist said, they still waiting on a response from a city council to a request that they sent in February the year before. So you can see, the delay really caused a lot of problem um, because journalists, the story, a delay would easily kill the story that journalists plan to do. And because of the lack of resources to appeal the rejection of their FR requests, this also means most of the time journalists would not, appeal to the ICO for a review. And in terms of access information via day-to-day basis, because decades of this establishing public relations system in UK government at the moment, journalists feel quite restricted, by the restriction posted by press officers, because they become a kind of single contact point for all the media inquiries. And although it might vary, the access might vary between different beats. For example, environmental topics might, be more the access be more fluent than the access to other topics. The third threat. Let me see. The third threat, it's more on the media ownership side, because in the UK, we kind of quite rare to see political authorities to directly tell news media not to publish those stories. So basically, journalists they all said, okay, they have not really been told not to publish anything, by political authorities, although the influence might come from different type of channels. For example, their freedom of publishing news might be limited by other by public relation people, or the government, the collaboration or close relationship between media owners and the political elites. So media ownership was seen as has very strong influence on news agendas of the newspapers. I cite one data from Media Reform Coalition. So in 2021, nearly about 90% of national newspaper market actually it's owned by just three companies, and 84% of local titles owned by six companies. So the situation is quite bad. And at the time of the research, actually, the majority of national newspapers were right wing and owned by just a few billionaires. And also the BBC's chairman and the director of general claim, sought to have conservative supporters. So therefore, media reformers, especially those campaigners who support media reform, actually they argue, because of the influence of media owners, British press have their own agenda to pursue. So it quite skew the news agenda delivered to audiences. So I just briefly, summarized these three main threats, but of course there are other related threats. For example, the casting political influence through personal contact, or online harassment, as echo other speakers spoke today. To summarize, although not comparable to the level of media control in authoritarian countries, media freedom in the UK is being undermined by three types of threats, with quite severe consequences for the democracy. One consequence could be self-censorship in terms of publication and pursuing stories, or even naming, the identity of people who are at the center of news stories. So another consequence could be, the alignment of news agenda with those of government as a result of controlled information access and also the personal influence. So I would be interested to see, after next year's general election, what's going to happen if Labour is going to be in power. So due to the time limitation, I'm not going to the detail, but the main report for this research project will be available in 2024.